So welcome to our event on the climate migration nexus. I would like to have a very brief introduction to this workshop or this webinar. Is that climate change is really an existential crisis, really jeopardizing lives, livelihood, safety, food security, water security, health, well-being, and culture. Like there are many of these that are really in our world that it has a very impact on us due to climate change, especially for children, youth, women, indigenous communities, the poor, vulnerable groups, especially global south. And we like to highlight that the most affected population is those from vulnerable populations. And we consider migration as an adaptation and survival strategy, while millions of people continue to be displaced by sudden onset or triggered by low onset events. However, the nexus between migration and climate change has not been really mentioned in these debates, discussion, policy interests, and negotiations at all levels, and until the only recent when there was a conference in the East and Horn of Africa in Kampala where migration and climate change were finally discussed. Due to these issues where they were not so mentioned, we would like to highlight that there is a huge gap in the climate change migration nexus when it comes to knowledge, data, evidence, awareness, and youth representations. So overall, I also would like to introduce our group, the organization team of this webinar, the Climate Migration Working Group of YOUNGO, which is a youth constituency to the UNFCCC, which is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So we are the group that is comprised of many different youth across the world who like to address these issues, like how we really want to include the climate migrations into the climate change, how we really want to address these vulnerable communities and how people are involved and how we really want to get engaged in this aspect. So today, in the first webinar of our series with the Climate Migration Working Group, our topic is Unpacking the Climate Migration Nexus. And we will have the speakers, Stephanie, Nora, Rowan, and Akwemi. So let me introduce to our speaker's bio. So Nora, actually, let me start from first. So Stephanie is originally from Brazil, but for the past 10 years, she's been living mainly in Europe in places such as Berlin, Madrid, Bucharest, and currently Rome due to educational and voluntary reasons. She holds a bilingual bachelor's degree in international studies, obtained between the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Sofia University, which is in Tokyo, and the National University of Singapore. She is currently finishing a master's in development, international cooperation at Sapienza University in Rome, together with interning with the Migration Issue Hub at the UNICEF New York headquarters. Together with her personal background, it has led her to develop a special interest for migration trends and its connection to human rights, gender, development, and climate change. She is also a member of several youth-led organizations and international initiatives that help her canalize her fighting towards climate justice, sustainability, environmental awareness, and more. And I would like to stop here and I will introduce the speakers after her section is finished. So I would like to welcome Stephanie Ulivieri of UNICEF to talk about the linkages between climate change, mobility, and children's rights.
Thank you so much, Yoko. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. Jess, can you pull up the PowerPoint? Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Stephanie. I'm an intern at the Knowledge Management and Capacity Building at the Migration Issue Hub here in UNICEF. Today, we'll be talking about climate change, children in the move, and children's rights. And I just want to underline that I'm actually filling in for our climate mobility expert who sadly couldn't be here today, but I hope I'll do justice to her work. So next slide, please. So this is a short overview of what we'll be focusing on today. So I'll give a brief introduction to the topic, followed by key definitions, concepts, and data on climate mobility. And lastly, I'll deal with the link between climate change, mobility, and children's rights. So to start with, next, thanks. So we know that the impacts of both slow onset disasters, such as, for example, environmental degradation, and sudden onset disasters like storms and floods, for example, all of these worsen by climate change, contributes to driving child mobility. So uprooted children and youth people are among the most exposed to the impacts of climate change, but they are also the ones with the least resources to cope. So at the same time, children and young people uprooted in the context of climate change have critical skills, experiences, and ideas to better mitigate and adapt to climate change. And they must be partners, they must be key partners in shaping solutions. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So following up, I would like for us to understand a little bit more the data, definitions, and language, which are important to help us engage with this topic. Next slide, please. So here are a few key terms that are worth mentioning. So children uprooted or children on the move are international or internal child migrants, refugees and asylum seekers, as well as internally displaced children or returnees. And within that, we see that we have climate mobility, which encompasses all aspects of climate change related migration and displacement, as well as planned relocation. So within climate mobility, we have two types, which is displacement related to climate change and migration related to climate change. So the first one is associated, let's say, with an involuntary movement, often caused by the threat of a sudden or slow onset disaster. So for example, for many families, this displacement is very sudden in nature. They have to leave from one day to the other. It's short term, so people tend to come back to their places of origin. And usually it occurs internally within a country's borders or immediately cross-border. The second, migration related to climate change, it's a form of movement that implies, to at least some degree, that the move is voluntary, that there are a few questions surrounding the voluntary nature of any migration related to climate change. Next slide, please. So 1 billion children are at extremely high risk of climate change impacts. And most climate mobility, it's internal within the country's borders. And it happens within the country's borders. So we can see that over 9.8 million weather-related internal displacements of children were recorded in 2020. 400 million children live in areas that face high risk of cyclones, for example. 330 million children are highly exposed to riverine flooding, and additional 240 million face a high risk of coastal flooding. And 850 million, approximately 1/3, I would say, are exposed to 4 or more climate stresses. Next one, please. So as you can see over here, almost all 29 out of 33 of the countries with extremely high climate risk for children are also in fragile contexts. So 1/4 of countries with extremely high climate risk for children also have a very high level of displacement, with more than 5% of the population displaced within its borders. Moreover, 95% of the conflict-related displacements recorded worldwide in 2020 occurred in countries with high climate risks. Next slide, please. So you heard me talking a lot about big numbers and overall figures. So while the impacts of climate change are widely recognized as one contributing factor to human mobility, a direct causal connection between climate change and mobility has not been proven and should therefore be avoided in our language. This is basically saying that we cannot use sentences such as people move because of climate change as an overall and complete affirmation. So there is also a lack of robust global figures on future climate mobility, with many different future projections existing and ranging from millions to billions, depending on the methodology used. So for example, when taken out of context or presented in very simplistic and generalistic ways, they can contribute to creating an alarming crisis narrative. So let's take a look to see at this example of this newspaper headline, which said, "Climate change will create world's biggest refugee crisis." It doesn't mean that these projections should be ignored. However, it's extremely important to consider the context and avoid using an alarmist language when discussing the nexus. So here we have some specific examples of terms that we recommend to use in green, and then of those that should be avoided in red. So for example, we should avoid saying things such as climate change refugee or environmental refugee, and instead focus more on the nexus. Next slide, please. So now I'd like for us to focus our attention on the specific nexus between climate change, mobility, and children's rights. Next one, please. So climate mobility is not always sudden and forced. It is often driven by an interplay of factors. So aspirations, socioeconomic, and climate-related factors. So even with major progress to mitigate the impacts of climate change, migration will continue to be an adaptation strategy for many. So we have existing evidence that suggests that young people are most likely to move in response to climate change shocks. And for many young people, this migration can actually provide opportunities to pursue, for example, their personal aspirations, diversify their skills, and contribute to the countries of their destinations. Next slide, please. So while the changing climate is a reality, it doesn't need to result in crisis for migrant and displaced communities. So if managed well, migration can actually bring new opportunities to those moving from vulnerable areas to more viable locations. So for example, migration of young workers between cities or countries can help fill critical skill gaps, and supporting to upskill young migrants, for example, to fill green economy jobs, which can help us transition to a low carbon economy. Now, if we can manage to watch this very short video. We can't hear.
Stephanie, we can't hear anything.
Yeah, we are having a problem with the audio.
If you can share your sound, I think we'll be able to hear you.
Yeah, just you need to share the computer sound. I don't want us to lose any more time. I'm gonna send the link over here of the video so we can keep up. Apologies for that. So you can all just, it's a very interesting video and it actually puts some faces to what we've been talking about. So we can move on. So currently, for those most at risk of the impacts of climate change, there are a few options to move safely and regularly across borders. So for example, we have the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is likely to protect actually only a small number of people displaced across borders in the context of climate change. So to qualify, people have to have a well-funded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. So the migration policies are also restrictive, requiring compliance with a host of bureaucratic issues. So for example, labor migration pathways or scholarship opportunities are often out of reach for children and young people in areas that are worse affected by climate change. Lastly, migrant workers are often unable to move with their families, so children actually get left behind. Next one, please. So climate change is acting as an additional stressor to children and families on the move. So the following factors combined make them particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So first, we have that the climate is changing everywhere, and children, both in rich and poorer countries, are and will continue to be affected. But migrant and displaced children and young people, whether they're living in forced displacement, in refugee camps, in urban slums, or for example, in booming mega cities, are among those more exposed to these impacts with the least resources to cope. Second, already at disadvantage, children on the move often face barriers to attending school, accessing healthcare, child protection, and other services that will help build their resilience. So third, uprooted children often live in and move to areas that are at high risk of climate hazard, shocks, and stresses. So for example, in informal settlements, in urban slums, coastal areas, and camps. So families may be exposed to these ongoing climate hazards, such as flooding, water shortages, sea level rise, and extreme weather events in a setting with already poor infrastructure, which doesn't help to protect them from these hazards. Lastly, uprooted children are often excluded from efforts to prepare, reduce risk, and build resilience in the context of climate change. Next one, please. So drawing on the previous slide, how do these compounding vulnerabilities of children on the move actually look like in reality? So let's take the issue of the barriers to education. So what does this actually mean for children? So school can provide a safe and supported environment for children and help them develop a sense of belonging, critical to building their capacity to bounce back from adversity, besides, of course, providing education. So schools are important entry points for disaster risk reduction and sharing information on climate change risk and adaptation. However, refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than their host community peers, and many migrant children are actually excluded from education based on their citizenship, migration, or legal status. So to illustrate, I'd like to mention the case of the Rohingya in Bangladesh. So Bangladesh is one of the most disaster-prone countries in the world and experiences annual monsoon and cyclone seasons. The host is also country to more than 800,000 Rohingya refugees, most of whom live in camps around the Cox's Bazar area. So the topography and the living conditions mean that the impact of the annual monsoon rains have these devastating consequences for the Rohingya refugees. The camp in the areas prone to landslide and flooding, and the houses are often built closely together and they are normally made out of very weak materials. So for example, in July 2021, last year, in 1 week alone, flooding and landslides forced at least 24,000 refugees to abandon their shelters. Moreover, only 3% of young people aged between 15 and 24 are receiving any form of education within these camps. Next one, please. So to conclude, I'd like to present this table that shows examples of how the rights of children on the move are particularly at risk from climate change related setbacks. Some of the main areas are related to health, education, non-discrimination, and children with disabilities. More concretely, in the case of health, for example, many families are affected by climate change mobility, settled in informal settlements and squats, that they face certain problems such as overcrowding, poor ventilation, and limited access to water and sanitation facilities, situations all of which impact, for example, their health. In addition, children affected by climate change related displacement and migration may also experience mental health and issues and trauma. So for the case of education, if these systems are not strengthened to support children affected by climate change related displacement and migration, millions of children might face barriers in accessing education. So for the right to non-discrimination, harmful gender norms and dynamics intersect with climate change related displacement and migration to further challenge access to education, as well as to gender sensitive and child-friendly information and services. And lastly, children with disabilities are often left out of policy, funding, and data considerations, something which not only limits their opportunities, but also holds back adaptation to climate change. And this is it from my side. Thank you so much for the space, and I'm open to any questions.
Yoko, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, is any question like anyone can ask? Any question also from any speakers or any hosts? So some comments in the group was that this was very informative and very good. It was very lovely presentation, straightforward and clear. Okay, I guess I will actually ask a question. I don't know if it was me.
Yoko, sorry, I think there is a question from Svetlana. She asked what would be a correct narrative. Thank you so much for your question, Svetlana. I wish my colleague would be here because she is the climate mobility expert. However, and from what we saw in this presentation, so the narrative needs to be more complex from what it tends to be, right? It cannot just be these alarmist headlines and 500 million people are going to move because of that. We should always try to contextualize and also understand that these numbers really rely on methodology. So maybe with one methodology, you get 500 million, but with another one, you get 100. So it needs to be more complex in that way. And we always need to keep in mind of trying to sway the narrative against this sort of mainstreaming and scapegoating of migrants, which unfortunately happens. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and there is another question in the chat. And the question is, how will you believe will be the 3 key goals for addressing migration?
Oh, wow. I don't think I can pack that. Thank you, Akami, for your question, by the way. I actually would like to get back to you on that because I myself don't know if I could condense how migration should be addressed only in 3 main points. So yeah, but thank you for your question. It's really good food for thought. I see some hands up. I think people can just unmute and go ahead. Rhonda?
Yes, hi. I'm Rhonda. I'm from UNICEF. I am also not the climate expert on the team, unfortunately, but I did want to reinforce the idea of a positive narrative. And I think most important is from UNICEF's perspective, we really try to avoid using the term climate refugee because it is such a limited legal, the word refugee has legal implications that, and there are so many more people that are being impacted than just those that would meet that very clear definition. And we also really focus on using the word mobility, as Stephanie spoke about, because it's much broader, more inclusive, and mobility implies sometimes displacement, but also the choice involved. So we're trying to focus on the opportunity before us if young people are provided the opportunity to participate, if we're able to really proactively use it as an opportunity for people, rather than just focus, sort of trying to be solutions focused, opportunity focused, look at prevention, rather than looking at what tends to be a very negative type of narrative. So just wanted to emphasize that. And in terms of the 3 solutions, I think that's why we're all here to have us all co-create that together. Thank you.
Yes, Rhonda, I actually wanted also to add on that that is why we're here to unpack that nexus and those goals. And I wouldn't want Stephanie to go and speak out on those roles until we reach that specific parts of this session. I also had a question regarding not calling them climate refugees. I was wondering, what if someone has been displaced by a rapid onset flood, and then all of a sudden they have no home, they have nowhere to go, they are left homeless? How do we call them?
That's a big question for international organizations and all of that, because as I mentioned earlier, according to the 1951 Refugee Convention, refugees are these people that are categorized, for example, if you're based on your race, ethnicity, if you can provide sort of legitimate fears for coming back to your country. Unfortunately, climate change has not been adopted as a legitimate reason for that. So that's why climate refugee doesn't have any legal stance, as Rhonda started on, but I would love for her to jump in as well and participate.
Yeah, I think it's probably, we feel most comfortable speaking in terms of people being displaced by climate-related impacts. I think using the word displaced is something that we do quite comfortably. We're just a little bit more careful about using the word refugee.
Okay, thanks. Yoko, could you please speak up, because we are running behind schedule?
Yeah, sure. I was just listening with conversation because it sounds so amazing, interactive discussion. I just distracted a year ago. Anyway, so our next session is experience from the youth panel discussion. And you will have Nora, Akwayemi, and Lauren. So I will, and Ishan, I will just give a very brief bio for each person. So Nora works with the IOM migration, which is the UNGC, and also the Environment and Climate Change Unit in the East Horn of Asia Regional Office in Nairobi, and coordinates the Regional Joint Program and Migration, Disasters, and Climate, implemented in the Intergovernmental Authority of Development region. She is a geographer, a certified project manager, and a certified monitoring and evaluation specialist, or actually that's more like MAE. And then she has gained her almost 20 years of work experience in UN Migration Agency, IOM in Kenya, Finnish Embassy in Nairobi, private sector, and different NGOs implementing development cooperation projects. She has 2 bachelor's degrees in business administration and in science, and a master's degree in science, or rather the geography. She is currently finalizing her master's degree in evaluation. She is enthusiastic about promoting human rights, sustainable development, and evidence-based responses. I will also give an introduction to other speakers at the same time. So Akwayemi is from London. He is a 24 years old student author, activist in reducing inequality, inclusion rights, and quality of education. Also as a youth delegate, young leader, young trustee, younger member, entrepreneur, CEO, founder, and keynote speaker and philanthropist. And finally, Lauren Grant is the director of field research at Earth Refuge, the planet's first legal think tank dedicated to climate migrants. In 2022, Lauren founded the first of its kind international school on climate migration, an educational initiative co-hosted by Earth Refuge and SOS, University of London. She holds a master's science degree in violence, conflict, and development from the latter, as well as a master's of arts degree in human rights law from Central European University. And I will give the floor to Nora.
Thank you so much, and super happy about the previous presentation. I hope to reiterate a little bit on that and also maybe respond to some of the questions that were presented in the chat from the perspective of the International Organization for Migration, the UN Migration Agency. And YOUNGO, thanks so much for bringing in the Kampala youth engagement, which happened in July, particularly on the migration, environment, and climate change. So I will start by going a little bit back and giving some data from global perspective and from migration. And these are figures from the World Migration Report 2022, looking at figures in 2020. So there were international migrants, 281 million overall in globally. And 135 million of these were female, and 69 million labor migrants. I'm just picking up a few figures here. I'm actually towards the end sharing with you a list of different links, which I believe are very good resources if you're interested in this topic to look at more thoroughly. And there is a recent publication from IOM today looking at particularly the climate change, migration and environment angle that's included there as well. I work in the Eastern Horn of Africa region, so I have some figures here from the African continent, but I understand there can be others as well in this call. But the distribution of international migrants residing in Africa, mostly in the east and west, and third in the south. And we can see from here also that the migration happens mostly inside the continent. And typically people move either inside their countries or within their neighboring countries or within their regions. And this I also want to emphasize, which was brought up also by Stephanie. Regarding to the narrative, I also want to mention here that migrants themselves, they do contribute to sustainable development, and one component of that is through the remittances. But there are also other factors how migrants can contribute through their skills and knowledge, through investment, through diaspora, through different means that the migrants themselves can also participate in climate action as well. Although here the bigger figure is general remittances, which sometimes goes to the basic needs, but that can be also considered as investing into the climate action. We mentioned the displaced persons, and indeed it's easier to capture the data when we are talking about the sudden onset events such as floods, because that is something that it's easier to capture that when we then talk about the slow onset events such as droughts or environmental degradation, because as Stephanie also mentioned, the reasons are actually complex and it's multi-causal. I'll come back to that a little bit more further. But this is the figure 89.4 million people living in displacement. And this considers displacement because of natural hazards and disasters, but also conflict. And I also have here these figures for sub-Saharan Africa. This is from the IDMC displacement data. And they do provide this globally. So these figures are available also for other regions. We talked about this terminology in the previous session, and this is indeed challenging. When you look at the news, when you look at different agencies, there are different ways to define when we talk about migration in the context of changing climate. And many times you see this climate refugee, but there is also many other and basically reiterating what Stephanie says, that in the international law, this terminology there isn't commonly agreed terminology on this, but then of course, as any other human, the migrants are as well protected under the human rights, humanitarian law, and many other international binding legal frameworks. So I go a little bit more into the terminology, hopefully not to confuse you, but to create this understanding that indeed there are different terminologies. We heard about the human mobility, and under the Cancun Climate Change Adaptation Framework, it's namely considered through the displacement, the forced movement of persons, through migration, the voluntary movement of persons, but then also there is the concept of planned relocations, which is a planned process where people are settled into a new location because of their exposure to hazards, for example. I also want to mention how IAM defines migrants. This is a very broad definition, and it considers actually almost any person who is moving or has moved across borders, whether those are international borders or within a state, regardless what their legal status is, regardless if the movement is voluntary or involuntary, what the causes are, and what the length of stay is. The definition is broad, for the purpose of not leaving anyone behind. We also have a working definition for environmental migrants, and IAM promotes the use of environmental migrant or climate migrant. And the difference between this definition to the migrant is that here we actually say what the reasons are. So the sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions. They are obliged to leave their habitual homes or choose to do so, either temporarily or permanently, and who move within their country or abroad. We also heard about the disaster displacement, and there is a definition under the non-SEN protection agenda, and this refers to the forced movement. People are obliged to leave their homes or places of residence because of disasters or in order to avoid such. I already mentioned the planned relocation. This is different from evacuations or relocation, resettlements. So this is a planned process in which person or groups of persons move or are assisted to move away from their homes or places of temporary residence and are settled in a new location and provided with conditions for rebuilding their lives. But then when we talk about migration, there are different typologies. One is the labor migration, where people move because of the purpose of employment. And this is a lot that we see also in the region that I work. And it's possible that these reasons are then complemented by the environmental factors. For example, the region is very heavily agriculture and rain-fed agriculture dependent. So if there are changes or degradation in the environment that influences the livelihoods, and then the reason could be stated to be employment, even though the environmental aspect is as well there. We have a lot of transhumans in this region, which is the movement of pastoralists together with their livestock to access water and pasture, and heavily also influenced by the climatic factors. I wanted to mention here that indeed the context always matters. The mobility flows and trends, they are always mixed types. There are different factors which are often interrelated that influence the decisions or opportunities for people to move. And these are those economic, political, socio-cultural, environment, and different levels of reasons. And in addition to what I mentioned earlier, we can talk about circular or seasonal migration, return migration, rural-urban migration, labor migration I mentioned, international cross-border migration, including diaspora, refugees, asylum seekers, pastoralists, but also trapped populations, those who would like to move, but they don't have the capacities to actually move. So there are different typologies. Migrants as such, they are also not homogeneous group, but, and I mean, we can discuss also if it's always good to categorize, but these do exist, just to let you know. And when we talk about the environmental migration, there indeed are several also environmental and climatic factors that influence. I believe we have people from different parts of the world as well. So it would be nice if you could write in the chat what are the environmental reasons in your country or in your region that you think that make people to move or influence the decisions. In our regions, it's typically drought or environmental degradation, because this influences the people's livelihoods. And I mentioned the agriculture and pastoralism already. But we also have floods. It's a major issue in this region, influencing the living conditions. We have also other environmental reasons, looking at landslides. We have pollution, waste, changes in the water level, and others. So please do write in the chat if I'm missing something here. And this is just basically to summarize what was discussed by Stephanie and also by me here, that the environmental factors, they rarely act in isolation. It's always very contextual and depends on the exposure to the different aspects of the environment. And then it depends what is the social, political, economic, demographic situation in the country, what kind of responses there are from the policies, what are the opportunities for people to cope and adapt to the situations, going into the detailed level, what's the situation in the household, what's your gender, what's your age, all these different factors influence the opportunities. And what does IOM do? This one maybe responds to the 3 goals. Our strategic objectives are to support finding solutions for people to move, so migration as an adaptation, support finding solutions for people on the move, so protection, and support finding solutions for people to stay, so adaptation and resilience. And just to basically conclude here, we can say that the environment and climate change factors, they play a significant role in shaping human mobility, with the sudden onset disasters and slow onset processes leading to different migratory outcomes. And migrants moving because of climate and environmental change, they are protected by the international human rights law, like any other persons. And I want to bring the gender aspect here because it is very important. The impacts are typically felt differently depending on the gender and the social context. So I want to emphasize that. And thinking about the reasons why environment and climate change influences the lives is because it influences their living conditions, their jobs, their livelihoods, and therefore also the decisions and opportunities. And this was also mentioned by Stephanie, that indeed, if people need to move, they will also need to enter the labor markets, and creating jobs and facilitating green economy environments that can be enhanced through different policies, but also through partnerships and recognizing this and bringing the skills development and knowledge, and of course access to finance in there as well. And I also want to really emphasize that the migrants themselves can contribute to build the resilience of communities and adapt to climate change. And this can be through different means, the migrants themselves, whether they are on site or in diaspora, through investments and remittances and such. And here is the big list of readings. I will share this list with the organizers, so we can share with you. And yeah, this is a very selected list of readings. So I hope you find this informative and be interested so that you can find more information. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Yoko, please, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Does anyone else have a presentation in this section? If anyone has any question, please also raise your hand, ask your question in the chat. And one of the questions is, could we have access to the readings, the PowerPoint, please? And I think we can share that if the speakers are fine with that.
May I have a question to IOM presenter? Do you allow me to questions, Ms. Yoko?
Yes, please ask.
Thank you very much. Here is an Ambassador Dr. Muhammad Shahid Amin Khan. I am the head of the International Human Rights Commission and as well as the former advisor to the Prime Minister of Pakistan. It's a very good presentation has been given by the NORA on behalf of the International Organization of Migration. My question is that international human rights law covered so many things and so many aspects. While we are discussing about the migration and climate change, there is some legislation on an international level into the framework of the United Nations so that this migration level has to be protected. Already we have seen it that the migration in across the board on the different aspects, social aspects, war and conflict aspects, the many countries are not following the international human rights law. So what sort of the cover, if she can emphasize that what sort of the cover and legal cover, basically the legal, international legal cover, the people, those who are affected by the climate change, the aspects of the climate change, if they migrated into the different countries, will that countries are bound to oblige them or not? This is the most important and specific question. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the question. I'll just briefly respond that there are indeed legal frameworks that respond to displacement, for example. Looking at the African Union, for example, there are. And yeah, in the IGAD region, there is a free movement protocol, which is adopted but not ratified yet by the countries of the region, which particularly looks at displacement when it comes into the cross-border settings. So indeed, there are, and I'm sorry, I can't be very comprehensive on this. I'm not expert in the global law frameworks, so please forgive me with that. But yeah, in the displacement setting, indeed, there are frameworks that cover. Thank you.
And there is a question in the chat from Akoyemi. What level of support is being delivered for these countries? And it's another question from Pomogisa. What structure has IOM developed to address the climate migration nexus? It would be great if these questions are answered by the speakers.
Thanks so much. I can quickly take that. And I have to, if you have more questions, please do write in the chat. And I would like to ask the organizers to send to me because I have to take other meeting in a couple of minutes. But I would refer to the strategy that we have, that we work on finding solutions for people to move, migration as an adaptation, people on the move, the protection issues, and people to stay. So then always depending on the particular context, we are looking at supporting finding those solutions. And they are typically multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder, so that there is also the engagement of different stakeholders. The program that I am coordinating, we are looking at the supporting the implementation of the Global Compact for Migration, and it's crucial that we have different principles of the Global Compact for Migration incorporated, which comes to the human rights, they come to gender, people-centered, whole of society, whole of government, all these different principles are important when we are doing our programming. And in the region here, we do support policy work, we do a lot of research, and also then work with the local communities. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Because we're running out of time, we will note your questions in the chat, and we will give the presentation to Laura.
Hello, I'm gonna share my screen very quickly here. Okay. Can you confirm that you can see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Great, okay. So thank you, of course, to the organizers for putting this event on. Particularly, I'm excited to see youth education and engagement on the topic of climate-related displacement, as I cannot stress enough the need to continue planting seeds for and inspiring young people to engage with this humble but rapidly growing sector, where so much work is yet to be and needs to be done. So today I'm going to talk briefly about agency, that is the freedom of choice or lack thereof associated with climate-related mobilities and immobilities. In other words, the choice of individuals, households, and to a lesser extent communities to move or their choice to stay in the wake of climatic impacts and environmental change. So at the outset, I chose to focus on this particular issue so as to highlight the critical need to consider not only the wishes, needs, and agency of those who are exposed to climatic threats and who thus face the threat of displacement relatedly, but also to highlight the need to consider both mobility and immobility when unpacking the climate migration nexus, as often those who wish to remain in place are left outside of discussions on climate-related mobilities. So let's bear this in mind as we delve in very briefly today. So I want to begin by encouraging everyone to think about an expansive definition or understanding of what we mean when we talk about climate-related mobilities and immobilities. So we often hear about slow and rapid onset climatic events as drivers of displacement, which my fellow panelists have touched on, and I will also continue to touch on throughout this presentation. But I wanted to start by adding a few other examples of instances and threats that we might start to think about including within our discussions around the relationship between climate change, environment, and migration or displacement, as well as within our development of solutions-oriented frameworks to address kind of the multifaceted nature of these interactions. So firstly, I want to encourage us to think about dispossession and displacement, sometimes of entire communities, particularly indigenous communities tied to extractive industries. This often, of course, occurs at the hands of multinational corporations, through state policies that privilege economic interests over environmental ones and often indigenous ones in many cases. And such displacement tends to occur under the auspices of so-called development projects, which again often occur at the expense of local environments and peoples residing in them. So relatedly, we often see environmental degradation in these areas, which is often then exacerbated by the impacts of climate change, that can then also lead to environmentally related displacement. So we might also start to think about climate-based development-induced displacement, which often occurs ironically in the name of a public good to combat the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation under the auspices of sustainable development. So we're seeing this increase, unfortunately, as conservation efforts lead to displacement, as climate change adaptation and mitigation programs and policies increase in recent years, which is a rather ironic feature. Though throughout the rest of the presentation, I will focus on slow versus rapid onset drivers of displacement, I wanted to kind of situate the nexus of environmental factors and conditions and changes within their relationship to migration and displacement, and encourage us to think about their relationship for mobilities and immobilities, as well as the agency of communities, households, and individuals. So as I'm sure you've noticed by now on today's panel, it's rare to sit through a presentation on climate-related mobilities or immobilities and not learn about the distinctions between slow and rapid onset climatic events that drive migration and displacement. So let's dive in with the basics. I'll try to expand just briefly here, as my colleagues have covered it quite well, how each relate to agency or lack of for those who choose to stay or who move or who are forced to move. So sometimes the distinction between slow and rapid onset events and how they drive displacement is very clear, particularly in the case of rapid onset events, which are particularly single or typically single discrete events with a clearly identifiable beginning and or end that occur or reoccur in a matter of days or hours, usually happening at local, national, or regional scales. So they might include floods, cyclones, storms, and hurricanes, so on and so forth. So here we might think of the millions of people who are currently displaced in Pakistan due to recent floodings. We might think about the 23.7 million people who were displaced related to disasters in 2021 alone, or countries like Afghanistan, China, the Philippines, Ethiopia, and South Sudan, which are currently the countries with the largest numbers of internally displaced persons related to disasters. So in terms of agency, these events typically do not offer any prospect of choice for those who are forced to leave suddenly to survive. Hence, we might think of rapid onset events as leading to forcible displacement as opposed to chosen instances of migration, which we'll continue to discuss in the coming slides. But still, in these situations, economic, social, political, cultural, and legal factors might be of consideration in terms of the likelihood and prospects for individuals, households, and to a lesser extent communities to return to their homes in the wake of such disasters, let alone to repair these homes or rebuild them if needed, or to be able to afford new ones in the case that their homes are destroyed. Slow onset events, on the other hand, are a bit more tricky. So these events are usually best understood as processes, as phenomena caused or intensified by anthropogenic global warming that take place over prolonged periods of time, typically years, decades, or even centuries, without a clear start or end point. So they include things like sea level rise, soil, land, and riverbank erosion, land and forest degradation, drought and desertification, to name a few. So here we might think of the 1.3 million people who have been displaced related to drought in East and the Horn of Africa in recent years, including 1 million people in Somalia alone since January 2021. So in terms of agency, these events tend to pose much greater challenges for deciphering between forced and voluntary nature of movement, often attributable to their longer timescales. So in these instances, economic factors are almost always a consideration, taken together with adaptive capacity of individuals, households, and again, to a lesser extent, communities, as well as the perceptions of the threats. It's important to note, however, that sometimes the distinction between slow and rapid onset climatic events as drivers of human mobility, whether forced or voluntary, is not always so clear. So the IDMC, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, points out, for example, that slow onset events may turn into a disaster prompted by a rapid onset event, or on the other hand, slow onset events can act as a hidden aggravator, in many contexts, acting as a threat multiplier for other drivers of crisis and displacement. So further, in terms of agency, particularly for slow onset climatic events, individuals and households are tasked with a nexus of factors to consider when making their decisions to move or stay as climatic impacts intensify and local environments erode. So in the first instance, people migrate for complex reasons. Individuals will assess their adaptive capacity, their ability to cope alongside the threat of a deteriorating environment, relying on their environmental perceptions, and they will consider migrating when environmental change is understood as having a major impact on well-being, and when attempts to mitigate or adapt to impacts have previously failed or are perceived as likely to do so in the future. Their socioeconomic position, and thus the resources which are available to them, is a near guaranteed factor in individual and household decisions to move or stay in the wake of slow onset climatic events such as drought in particular. So economists often purport that potential migrants will calculate their expected earnings in the place of origin in comparison with various destinations, whereas sociologists will often point to the pull of social networks in terms of the prospect of providing support in destination locations. And political scientists, on the other hand, will stress conflict, violence, and political instability as compounding push factors to climatic impacts as they interact. So the diagrams on my slides here present a handful of the factors that are often considered in decisions to move or stay, most relevant in the case of slow onset climatic impacts. Black and colleagues' diagram on the right interestingly places environmental factors at the center to show how these amplify and exacerbate other pre-existing vulnerabilities and social, economic, political, cultural, and demographic factors. Importantly here, I want to point out that Black and colleagues mention the relevance of incentives in decisions to move or to stay, and to highlight here the likelihood of receiving assistance and legal protection in the case of moving or staying as being factored into the decisions to move or stay. So I contend that the decisions to move or stay result from the intersections of these multiple and complex environmental, economic, political, social, cultural, demographic, and legal factors as potential drivers of migration. So in any case, when people do migrate, whether forced or voluntary in nature, such movement is not at all homogeneous for all persons or groups. So instead, and I'll be quite brief here because I do think my fellow panelists touched on this quite a bit already, most mobility related to the impacts of climate change occurs internally within the borders of a country as opposed to cross borders, as well as the fact that we see many flows of migrants related to the impacts of climate change moving only short distances. So interestingly, a 2010 study by Professor Jane McAdam, who's a kind of leading legal scholar on the topic, had found in a rural part of Bangladesh in the case of river erosion where just shy of 600 households had to relocate, the average distance moved was just 1 kilometer, with the maximum distance being 10 kilometers. So I often highlight this so as to show that sometimes moving, in particular when kind of sudden onset disasters occur, is a matter of being able to get out as quickly as possible, as opposed to a kind of, it's more of a makeshift kind of reaction or response in more temporary terms. So we are also seeing increasing numbers of people moving from rural areas to urban areas as urbanization expands across the world, as well as rural to rural migration, and again, a high correlation of where migrants are moving to as tied to their social networks. So also heterogeneous are the temporalities of these climate-related migration flows, which can include temporary or permanent relocation, cyclical migration, often tied to employment prospects, as well as seasonal relatedly, as well as planned relocation, which has been touched on a bit. So we might start to think about how agency plays out in all of these various scenarios as migration patterns interact with changing environmental conditions. So the question of agency in the case of climate-related mobilities and immobilities is in many ways a question of how we frame the nature of compounding threats or drivers, as well as the discourses we attach to decisions to move or stay. So for example, discourses of migration, as we've already seen today, tend to imply that there's a sense of agency or choice on behalf of the persons who move or who don't move, which tends to become associated with slow onset events, whereby individuals, households, and communities are tasked with assessing when to move and are arguably presented with more time and hence more understood to be more freedom to choose whether to leave or to stay. Discourses of forced displacement, on the other hand, tend to imply a forced coercive nature of displacement in which those who move do not have a choice in the matter. From an agency standpoint, on the other hand, we have voluntary immobility, where individuals, households, and communities may choose to remain in place voluntarily, even in the wake of intensifying climatic threats. Anecdotally, at times we see this amongst Indigenous communities or those with special attachment to lands, resources, and environments. And then we have the question of what Black and colleagues refer to as trapped populations, which particularly from the lens of agency provokes the question of whether some individuals, households, and again, in rare cases, communities risk becoming trapped, which may include those who want to move but who are unable to move, often tied to financial constraints. In my recent research, I've expanded upon this definition to include those who are trapped by the nexus of social, economic, political, and cultural factors, as well as the absent likelihood of receiving legal protection or assistance in the case of moving or staying in place. So in summary, how we problematize and therefore respond to the differences and intersections between these scenarios and the agency or lack of associated to each has very large implications for how we tend to think about responding. So for example, legal protection is often afforded or at least mandated to be afforded under international refugee law and IDP laws in cases where movement is forced and not in cases where there's a matter of choice or where it's seen as voluntary. So finally, when we think about developing responsive solutions to climate-related mobilities, we must continue to ensure that we place the agency of persons in question at the center of our discussions. So we must also ensure that solutions-oriented frameworks account not only for mobilities, but also for immobilities across sectors relevant to or related to preparedness, including resilience building, responsiveness, including legal protection and assistance. We must also ensure that those who may be at risk of becoming trapped, as well as those who choose to remain voluntarily, particularly those with a strong attachment to lands and resources such as Indigenous groups, are not lost in our discussions around climate-related mobilities and immobilities and in the solutions that we develop to respond to them. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Laura, because we are really out of time. So we will ask the participants to ask your questions in the chat.
Okay.
And maybe the speaker will also respond in the chat.
Yeah.
And also we will also perhaps also have your questions in mind in your email, and we'll also respond to the participants. And we will now pass now to Ishan.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. My name is Ishan Shah. I'm 19 years old, based in London, in the United Kingdom, and the founder of Stolen Dreams, which is an international youth-led collective working to counter modern slavery and human trafficking. I also work very closely with UN Women as a national youth advocate, and I'm the UN Office on Drugs and Crime's youth focal point for the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And so as colleagues before have explained, there are a lot of vulnerabilities that people, especially young people and women and girls, face when it comes to climate-induced migration, and the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation as a whole. And these vulnerabilities sort of exacerbate other vulnerabilities to modern slavery and human trafficking. And this is the nexus that I would like to focus on very briefly. I won't go into too much detail because I'm conscious of time as well. But for context, modern slavery is an umbrella term for several highly exploitative practices, including trafficking in persons, forced labor, domestic servitude, sex exploitation, forced marriage, and the worst forms of child labor. Trafficking in persons, or also known as human trafficking, refers to the act of recruiting, transporting, harboring, or receiving persons through legal and illegal means across international borders or within a country by means of threat, use of force, or other forms of coercion or fraud. And it's for the purpose of exploiting them. So for human trafficking to be human trafficking, you need to have the act, the means, and the purpose. And human trafficking is very different to migrant smuggling or illegal immigration. And it's an important distinction that we have to make in this sector. Illegal immigration and migrant smuggling refers to the movement of people across international borders, and smuggling stops when the person reaches the destination. Whereas human trafficking requires sort of exploitation, so it's continued, and it doesn't have to be across international borders. It can be from one house to another, for example, or one village from another, or within a country itself. So it's important to stress these definitions, because when it comes to migration, in particular climate-induced migration, when people are forced to leave their homes and are sort of desperate to find pathways to sort of escape, they often will fall into the hands of traffickers who know exactly how, when, and where to take advantage of these vulnerabilities. And often survivors of human trafficking are treated as illegal immigrants, and their experiences of exploitation are completely overlooked. And despite contributions to our economy, to societies, to politics, to every aspect of public and private life, migrants and survivors of human trafficking worldwide suffer a lack of meaningful protection, and they also experience a wide range of exploitation and abuse, including trafficking in persons. And this all disproportionately impacts women and girls. So the latest global estimates of modern slavery dictated that over 50 million people are in modern slavery worldwide, which is an increase of 10 million people since the 2016 estimates. So the increase is for a number of reasons, due to sort of the way in which data is collected has improved. So the numbers have increased in that sense, but also, we're seeing more and more research being invested into the links between climate change and modern slavery, into identification. And we know that other compounding crises like COVID-19, for example, but also conflict as well, are contributing in intersecting ways. So international standards are very much present. They dictate on what stakeholders should be doing to combat trafficking in persons in the context of climate change. You have the Global Compact on Migration, you have the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, which has the protocol on trafficking in persons, especially of women and children. You have the Commission on the Status of Women as well, which earlier this year was discussing climate change in the context of gender equality. So you have a lot of these international standards that are present in writing, but there is an absence of implementation, and the failure to adopt a human rights-based approach to climate migrants and human trafficking has enabled rapidly growing political and corporate attitudes towards migration. And this allows complicit parties, including states and the private sector, to enjoy impunity for a wide range of abusive practices. Moreover, there's a threat of retaliatory termination of employment, imprisonment, deportation, and this can really compel migrants to find illegal or unsafe migration routes that can often lead to migrants ending up in situations of trafficking in persons. The structural features of cross-border migration can enable, if not encourage, exploitation that then reaches trafficking in person extremes or modern slavery extremes. And in essence, what we really have to see is the political will from states to take action to reduce vulnerabilities to these forms of exploitation, abuse, and modern slavery by committing to the full and effective implementation of these guiding international, regional, and local climate migration and anti-trafficking in person frameworks which have grounding in international law. And there are several ways moving forward that stakeholders, particularly sort of governments, can sort of address these intersections between climate change, modern slavery, and the gender perspective as well. And the first way in which they can do so is really committing to the full, effective, meaningful leadership and inclusion of women and girls, especially migrant women, survivors of human trafficking that are women and girls as well. And this means at all levels of decision-making on climate change, from the very local grassroots level to the international stage. And this will really help to facilitate and concretize a catalyzed sort of version of action, I guess, in the context of reducing the impacts of climate change and preventing disaster and environmental degradation. And the participation of women and girls and survivors of trafficking in persons is fundamental, because they are experts in their own realities. They know what works well, they know what doesn't work, and we need to have their perspectives and their expertise and their experience centered in these conversations. We also need to see states commit to safer pathways for migration to reduce vulnerabilities to modern slavery and human trafficking. Upon arrival in destination countries, migrants have to be treated with dignity and respect. Human rights-based approaches must be adopted. And we have to avoid criminalization too, because often in periods of exploitation, people will break the law, they'll be forced to break the law, and you have to recognize that these are people who are in situations of exploitation and trafficking in persons, and they shouldn't be criminalized for any acts done as a result or during their period of exploitation. We also have to see investment in gender transformative, systematic disaggregation of data to boost research efforts towards achieving a better understanding of the differentiated impacts of climate change and trafficking in persons on women and girls. And of course, as I mentioned before as well, states really need to start implementing these international, these national and regional frameworks on a very concrete level. And this includes things like the Global Compact on Migration and other conventions that I mentioned so far. But also we have to recognize that addressing the wider problem of gender inequality is really crucial too. And this is one of the root causes, and colleagues have alluded to the root causes of climate-induced migration. But also we have to recognize as well that each of the Sustainable Development Goals contributes to modern slavery and human trafficking. So we have to achieve all 17 before we see the rates of modern slavery and human trafficking reduced. But ultimately it really boils down to this political will and also this corporate will too. We know that supply chains are tailored with and infested with human rights abuses. So it's really important that due diligence is carried out by corporates, and it's got to be an intergenerational, multi-stakeholder partnership. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to wrap up then, but I'll share some links in the chat to some further research. This is an area that is often overlooked in climate discourse, is the modern slavery and trafficking in persons side of thing. The Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons gave a report statement to the General Assembly on the nexus between climate change and trafficking in persons, so I encourage you all to look into that. And this is something that we're very much trying to push and bring onto the agenda, a very important aspect that's often been overlooked. But thank you very much for inviting me today.
Thank you for your section, Ishan. And yes, and because we are actually really mindful about time again, we will also pass right next to Akoyemi to talk about the inequality and inclusion issues and others. Akoyemi, I will pass.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Yoko, and thank you very much, previous speakers. My name is Akoyemi Claude. I am from the United Kingdom. And if we are going to look at unpacking migration, I think what is really crucial to look at is the importance of stability and the importance of taking priority of the Act 2 of the human rights, and also looking at the history of where migration kind of started to be able to make solutions. So I am a child of Caribbean descent and African descent families. And where we see the issues have been is, I think, the lack of leadership in certain world leaders, and the importance of making sure that the human rights and perfect areas of the migration is also taken priority. When we look at migration, there are different types of migration. We look at the weather effects of Afghanistan and also, Nigeria at the moment, and the importance of looking at migration in inequality, because there's been a big issue. We had 174 countries, as I can quote, that are still at war and still in conflict. But if we do not put light on those countries, then how would we be able to support them? At the moment in the UK, we've had 5 different prime ministers, but we have this issue where the investment and the stability for SDGs, for example, global goals, have not really kind of taken priority. Only 1 in 10 individuals in the UK know about the SDG global goals. So it's important we also improve the education aspect and inform others about this important factor of solutions. And it's important that we work closely to our governments and also make sure that every cabinet is talking to each other, because that is an issue which has been going on for years. And if we look at Afghanistan, that went from October the 7th, 2001 to August the 30th, 2021. I'm still at the age of 24, I was about 3 at the time. At the age of 24, we still have this Ukraine war, but there's other countries, as I said, who don't get acknowledgement. So I think it's important that we listen to the people, listen to the youth, to enableize solutions and enableize stability for the better of the future, to address these issues which we have in migration, for also the focus on climate. Thank you very much. I am open to any questions as well. You can feel free to put them in the chat.
Thank you, Akoyemi. And thank you. Then we will have the breakout room right now, and we will set up the breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will be actually a very interactive discussion on these issues, and that we could also perhaps the each representative from breakout rooms will also present at the end of the discussion, this meeting. Yes. Oh yeah, so I see that the breakout room is already ready right now. And please join the breakout room as retrospectively. And these breakout rooms are divided into different Africa regions: West Africa, North Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and South Africa, and speaking in a room that is specifically for French speakers. Yes, please join to any of the questions, the breakout room. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to breakout rooms. I hope that everyone is here. So we would like to hear your input from each of the breakout room in one sentence or one demand. And we would like to pass to the West Africa region. And if anyone wants to talk about one demand from West Africa.
I'm sorry for being a weird timekeeper, but each group has about a minute to share.
No problem. I'll be very quick. So we had very interesting discussions, and they all were mainly around the need for more capacity building opportunities for the youth, in which not only the space, but also power is shared. We also talked about the awareness creation and fostering of youth-based advocacy. And lastly, accountability with inclusive prevention within an intergenerational approach that strives towards inclusion. I hope that manages to catch mostly everything, but I have my notes here, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
That was timekeeping. That was super good time.
Okay, thank you. And then the next one will be from North Africa, if there's any input from North Africa.
Hi, yeah, I was facilitating the group for North Africa. We were quite a small group with just Cassian. So I'll ask him to introduce himself and share his thoughts. I'm sharing my screen as well, so you could read his inputs. But over to you, Cassian.
I guess you could just share because it's taking longer than you could just represent the group.
All right. So how is it the climate change affecting youth and children mobility in Africa? First, the crisis heartened by climate change, no future which is better for their life. And second, human trafficking, moving illegal immigration, unaccompanied children, lack of education. I want to just demonstrate the two things, and how we see human trafficking in North Africa, and why unaccompanied children in North Africa, and how can now manage it. First, we need a strong advocacy. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. We need a strong advocacy and to mobilize. Sorry for my English. I don't know if you can hear the French even. There's a French translation?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can I use the French?
I think
you can go on.
Yes.
Can I go on?
I know, I think it was enough. I mean, you can continue, but I think we also keep in mind of time. If you have any more inputs, please point to the chat which I'm sorry about forgot to mention earlier, but if you want to have more input, please just put in the chat so we can continue on. And yes, so we will continue to Central Africa. Any inputs?
I'm sorry, could you give me a minute? I wanted to share what my notes were on the screen. I only had one speaker as well. So if you could take up the next person, I'll just put it up in a minute.
Yeah, I just want to say that we don't really need any screen, but okay, I will move on.
All right, then just give me a second. Ghislaine, I would really suggest if you would go ahead because it was only the two of us.
Okay. So from Central Africa, to answer the first questions, we based our knowledge and our experience living in Central Africa. And we think that one of the main things affecting youth and children mobility in Africa is education. So we believe that due to this mobility, it really affects the youth in continuing their education, given that those who actually need to move are low income and middle income citizens, which can't afford that, and hence pushing these youths or these children to go hawking streets and a lot of things carry on from there. So answer the second question. We think that the role of a young person in addressing climate mobility is sensitization, because we believe that if you are able to sensitize the people, then they will be able to go on and carry out the right acts or processes in order to maintain their climate, in order to maintain their environment. And the government will only be another plus in fostering them or enhancing them to continue with that. One key priority or demands of a young person to stakeholders at COP27 and 28, we believe is coming in with your experiences and your skill set in order to help the leaders or the policymakers to make a sustainable system that would go beyond actually climate mobility. Thank you, I'm done.
Yeah, thank you. And I would like to pass to East Africa next.
Thank you. So I will try my best to summarize our discussion. The emphasis was on inequity, that East Africa has been very disproportionately impacted by climate change, yet is contributed the least to the cause. And that needs to be a major focus, as well as data and research, education of people impacted, the need to build hope with things like educational opportunities. And there was a lot we didn't get to, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. I will pass to the last session. I believe I touched all of them, to the South Africa.
Eric, do you want to share? Or I could just summarize. We're only 2 people in South Africa, and Eric raised great points regarding the need. I'm just skipping some of the things that have been repeated, but the key point regarding the need for policies that welcome people that are at risk and those ones that are in trouble or are on the move. And he gave an example of Uganda's open policy to refugees, and that's why many people go. Uganda has a refugee population of 1.5 million. So if there's cross-border collaborations and in-country collaborations, people will be able to move, those ones who are at risk and those ones on the move. The other point he also raised was really youth taking the power and recognizing that we need to protect our communities and support them in building their resilience and adaptive capacity. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for all your inputs from the 5 regions of Africa. And now the final part of this webinar is about the key demands and priorities from the General Draft Youth Declaration from YOUNGO. And I will pass to the responsible person to talk about this.
Okay, I guess I'll take it up. Thanks, Yoko, and thanks everyone for the contribution here and this amazing discussion. I just wanted to update you that the reason why you saw the breakout rooms where on Africa, I think most of you might have been wondering, is the fact that the continent has the most vulnerable people, especially having over 40 countries that are least developed, and out of 54 countries. But so we are working on the African Youth Declaration on Climate Mobility that we are going to be presenting at COP27 to our states, but also all other parties and other states. So that declaration has the youth voices and priorities and commitments. So we are being, as YOUNGO, the Migration Working Group, together with SCMI, which is the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative, and UNICEF and IOM, and the Migration Youth and Climate Platform, we are helping to bring together the youth voices. So we have a zero draft of the documents that we've been working on, but would like to hear all the voices from across the region, from across the continent, from all the regions, as you saw in the breakout rooms, from East, North, South, Central, West, like North Africa, like all the regions, we want the regions to be represented. So we are going to be sharing information with all of you and about this declaration that we need to work on. We'd like to hear your voices, but we are also planning to have a session that is dedicated to the declaration, where we'll, like, probably this week or next week. I have not yet confirmed the date, but we'll get back to you all, and we shall have that declaration only focusing on Africa, focusing on youth voices in Africa and demands and priorities. So, and also there will be some surveys asking you to input if you're not able to attend in person, or even if you're able to attend in person, but you want to share your voice through a survey. So all those ones will follow. And yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you for your contribution. So if anyone will be at COP27 or COP17, please let us know, and we would like to have it included in our program and really get our global youth statement. Can contribute? Yes, continue, Rose.
No, first finish. I just wanted to add that we are also organizing sessions for COP17 and 2 events on COP27 about climate migration and youth. So it will be really nice to collaborate with you all and have some of you as speakers and have some of you attending the session and contributing and interacting. So there's so much coming. If you'd like to join our group, and that is if you promise to be active, because we don't want people who just fill the group and not be active. So if you'd like to join the group, I'm going to share the WhatsApp link, or someone could help with sharing the WhatsApp link. And so, yeah, I guess Yoko, once you're done, you could wrap up and just let Olivia, because she's and Krista, if they have something to say.
Yes, and I don't know if that's a question from you, but because we don't have time, please ask a question in the chat as well. Or is there any update from your part of COP17? I don't know, but please also in the chat. Maybe we can also have you like to talk about something. And yeah, is any final comment from Crystal and anyone else? Otherwise, we have to mention that this is the first webinar on our 3 webinar series, and the next one will be on the 26th, and the last one will be on the 28th. And I believe that those links was shared with you when you registered for this event. Yes, please, again, Rose.
No, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to clarify that a few things will change. We won't have an event on 26th, but we shall let you know the next event regarding the African Declaration. Sorry.
Don't worry, because that is something actually that is very important to be addressed in this meeting anyhow, because that is a reminder there will be no meeting on 26th, even though it was actually also mentioned in our email distribution. Yeah, thank you. That's all from our group. Yes, and if anyone is able to share the link in the chat to join the migration group, would be great. And otherwise, we will have call an end to this meeting. And we'd love to have actually the youth from all across the world, not just Africans, to join migration, because our future COPs will be in different regions of the world, and we will also discuss from different perspectives. So it will be never too late to join us at this early stage and really continue to build on our momentum. And please be with us for the future and also get really connected, and also through partnerships like UNICEF and IOM, especially in this perspective of climate migration and climate change, and also beyond. Yes, just want to remember, just promise if you're active and join our WhatsApp group. And the WhatsApp group is now posted in the chat from our wonderful members of the Climate Migration Working Group and organizers of this webinar series. Again, thank you for joining us, and we will end this call.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.